Okay, hi everyone. I see people can now join. We're going to give it 4 minutes until we kick it off. So just hang on in there and we'll get started at 9 o'clock.
Does your mascot have a name?
It's a good question. Yeah, for people who are joining, this is Pam, our mascot. Pam.
What's the story of Pam?
Well, Pam, historically, we said teleport is privileged access management, but sort of a new way of doing it. And so there's sort of a throwback to the past of Pam, although which are not that closely aligned with privilege access management. We have lots of people sort of coming in using teleport for access management. And Pam's kind of a cute name. And for anyone who was at our conference, we had Pam in a suit.
Pam in a suit.
Yeah, so there's real life Pam. So if you come to any of our events in person, you might be lucky enough, or a large conference, you can meet Pam and get a selfie with her.
She reminds me a bit of Pepper, from IBM, the robot.
I don't think I've seen that one.
You should check it out. It's like basically it's a rolling around child-sized robot that has a huge tablet and has like similar fingers and can dance.
Perfect. That's what we need.
Yeah. What the world needs.
We need more dancing robots. Hi, everyone. As you sort of join in, we're just waiting for people to join. We'll start in, I guess, like 2 more minutes. Okay, 1 more minute and we'll kick things off. The chat's available. Colin, thanks for your message. And we'll also be taking Q&A throughout the presentation. So if you have any questions as they come up, we'll be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. So feel free to ask us questions as we go along. We're happy to answer your questions. Okay, it's 9 on the dot. So I think now's probably a good time to kick things off. Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. I'm really excited to be here with Anaïs from Aqua. And today we're going to be talking about the range of things, like most common Kubernetes security misconfigurations and how to address them. And as I've been preparing this webinar, I've done multiple deep dives into Trivy. It's been a great tool, and I'm really excited to not only find some of my misconfigurations, also learn how to fix them. So I'll do a quick intro and then I'll pass over to Anaïs. My name's Ben Arendt. I'm a developer relations manager at Teleport. And yeah, really excited to have everyone here today.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here. My name is Anaïs. I'm the open source developer advocate at Aqua Security. And you might hear in the background some coughing. That's my poor sick 4-month-old puppy. So I apologize for the background noise. Yeah, so here to talk about Trivy and misconfigurations. Go to the next slide. Oh, that's a puppy. Just
it's a great way to start the webinar.
Puppy pictures. Yeah, so apologies for any background noise. Let's hope it's gonna stay that way. Quite. Next slide. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to hear from everybody joining when you think of misconfigurations, just maybe post in the chat what comes to your mind. What are you thinking of? It could be like word, a buzzword, other buzzwords in the space, such as supply chain security, or anything that you're working with, any tools you're working with that might come to your mind when you're thinking about misconfiguration. A lot of times there's not an official definition of like how we actually like what is a term, but it's whether it applies to multiple different things. So I'm just curious of those who are joining today of what you think of when you hear misconfiguration. And yeah, I'm going to keep an eye on the
we have opened the world
as well.
And shouldn't be.
Oh, I will get to that. That's a good sentence. Next slide. I'm going to keep reading the chat in between. Yeah, so misconfigurations are part of, or like misconfiguration scans, hopefully not misconfigurations, misconfiguration security scans are part of the landscape of cloud native security scanning and also non-cloud native scanning. But here is an overview that I like to show of the different open source security scanners that we have in the cloud native space. So the most popular ones tend to be vulnerability scanners. We also have compliance scans that are talked about a lot, like when CNCF, KubeCon presentations, you will hear lots of people talk about compliance scans, compliance frameworks. Those are basically frameworks that look at how you should configure your resources, how your resources are supposed to run in your infrastructure, and then you can run scans to compare your running workloads with those frameworks and see how compliant is your infrastructure. So compliance scans kind of relates to misconfigurations as well. But then we also have a whole different separate family of misconfiguration scanners. And misconfiguration scanners scan anything related to your configurations, anything that defines how is your infrastructure supposed to run, and how is it supposed to interact with other resources. So rather than defining the application, it's like parts of the application, but it's not defining or like not interacting with the application directly. It's more like so to do with how is it running and how is it in your infrastructure. Now, in this talk, we're going to focus on Trivy because it's the open source tool from Aqua. When I say open source tools, you might realize that there are some not mentioned in this graphic because I don't consider them open source. When I say open source, it's like, in this case, you don't send us any data, you don't sign up to those scanners. Versus there are other scanners where you sign up, or where you kind of send a SaaS project information. And the thing is, that's particularly important for security scanners because to perform a security scan of your cluster, of your running workloads, that needs lots and lots of permission. So, and that's something just to keep in mind that we'll also go into more detail later on, that if you run a scanning from within your cluster on your running workloads, you will give that scanner lots of permission within your cluster. So you want to know exactly what is it doing. And with some of the scanners, it's not really clear of how much permission it actually has and how it's integrating with the SaaS tool. Next slide. So Aqua open source projects. We have Trivy, which is a eBPF-based Linux runtime security and forensic tool. It can be used as well in addition to Trivy. It's just not directly related to security scanning. Those two projects are fairly independent. Now, Trivy is our all-in-one security scanner. It started off with vulnerability scanning, then moved to misconfiguration scans, and now there's a whole suite of different security scans. So that's why we say it's the all-in-one scanner. Next slide. Here's an overview of everything that Trivy does. It is not just Trivy as like the project that just does all of those different features, but it's actually also using other tools under the hood. So for example, for misconfiguration scans, Trivy can scan your Terraform, your Kubernetes manifest, CloudFormation, Helm charts, also customize your Docker file, and also since this summer, your cloud accounts for misconfigurations. Now, in the case of Terraform, Trivy is using another tool called TFSec that's fairly popular in the space for its misconfiguration scanning. It just basically acts as this umbrella across like other projects. So you have this unified experience across your different scans. If you want to do misconfiguration scans and vulnerability scans, it's the same kind of process. Trivy can be used as a CI tool, either locally, or you can integrate it with steps in your CI/CD pipeline. Now we have lots of different steps available that you can just kind of copy and paste into your pipeline for more automated scanning. However, a lot of the misconfiguration scans will likely happen locally on your machine as you configure your resources, as well as within your running infrastructure. Trivy also has some additional features that I'm not going to go into SBOMs or attestation or anything related, but the in-cluster scanning, we will look at that a little bit, because as part of in-cluster scanning, we also do misconfiguration scans from in the cluster. Next slide. Thank you. So here's just more brief overview, a list of different scan targets that Trivy can get. So basically a scan target any resource that you want to scan for security issues, whether that's misconfiguration issues, exposed secrets within your workloads, or vulnerabilities. Next one. Thank you. So how do we actually go about identifying misconfigurations? What is the process for that? When do you do it? How do you get started? So once you start to package up your application to create a containerized workload, to create a container image that you can use and other people can use, that's when you get started to configure your cloud native workloads. Also for your Kubernetes deployments, right? So you have to define the Docker file of how is your application actually supposed to run, how is it packaged up, what other resources, what other third-party libraries you might be using, and similar. And that's when you can get started, not only to scan for vulnerabilities, but also for misconfiguration scans. And the earlier you get started across your development lifecycle with misconfiguration scans, the easier it will be to mitigate security issues further down the line. Now, once you have your container image, that's when you then likely want to package it, or configure it within a Kubernetes manifest, or if you have lots of Kubernetes manifests that relate to your application, you might want to use a templating tool, which is Helm or Customize. And then once you go to your deployment, you might want to use the tools such as Terraform to deploy your application. Now, each of these different tools across your stack will need different configurations, different ways of how they run your workloads in the end. And at each stage, you can obviously introduce misconfigurations. So it's really about this continuous process of performing the misconfiguration scans and then improving your configurations, your workloads over time. Next slide.
I think there's actually a question here around for container images, are the scans done at build time or at runtime?
You can do both. So once you define the Docker file, what you want to get started with is scanning your base image that you're using, or any third-party resource that you're using within that container image. Now, then when you use a CI/CD pipeline to build your container image, you want to maybe perform every time a scan of your Docker file and then packaged up container image, scan that. So that's basically a build time. And then once you deploy the container image to your infrastructure, use it within your tools, that's when you want to have a tool such as Trivy Operator that performs continuous scanning. So it's really at both stages you want to have scans, because I'm going to go into the reasons in the later slides as well, why you also want to have then scanning of your container images and your configurations at runtime. Next slide. Great question. Thank you. So how do you learn about misconfigurations? Now, you know when you have to, what kind of tools you're using, when you should do the scanning, but ultimately, how do you learn about common misconfigurations and how do you mitigate those? So there are different ways that I would recommend people to learn about misconfigurations if you're just getting started. Like there's really like in the cloud native space, or you have in the cloud native space, but maybe not so much focused on the security aspects of your containerized workloads, then I would just highly suggest you to check out the resources that are out there by organizations, such as the frameworks that I mentioned earlier. We have the CAS and the NSA framework that are very popular, that allow you to perform the compliance scans. Then companies such as Aqua, Sneak, Sysdig, and Teleport are publishing very valuable resources on an ongoing basis. Also, as soon as there's a new vulnerability coming out, you will find a blog post that details the vulnerability, how to identify it in your workloads with security scanners such as Trivy, and then how do you actually mitigate it? How do you go about it? And then obviously following security professionals in the space, using security scanners such as Trivy. I'm going to show you as well how you can use the scanner itself, like how to learn more about the misconfigurations as well. And through that, you build up your experience. It's really not a either or. This is really, I think, getting started with security in the cloud space is really like about a process, because ultimately you won't know, or it doesn't really help you to look up common misconfigurations and then go one by one through your workloads and see if they are there. That's not going to be very effective. You're probably going to forget, or most of the common misconfigurations, or they might not necessarily matter to your workload, some of them. So it really depends on what tools you're using and how you deploy them, and so on. So I don't think it's like something that you would have to study, such as how you would study other other areas in the space. Next slide. So let's look at some of the common let's look first at why does it matter for us to look at misconfigurations through tools such as Trivy. Can you click on that link? This is a very cool overview, a kind of repository of 2021 misconfigurations that resulted in data loss in different companies, the impact that it had, and why the data was exposed, for example. And you have here some, less critical, some more critical issues. Ideally, or why you want to use misconfiguration scanners, because you want to be the one with identifying any exposed endpoint, any exposed data before somebody else does it, so you can ensure that nobody's accessing, for example, the data in your S3 buckets. As you can see, there's lots of AWS listed here of like, it's very common to misconfigure your AWS resources, your services that you're using for AWS, because it's very difficult to configure those properly. So misconfiguration scanners such as Trivy can then also tell you if there are any things that you could configure differently in your cloud account. To basically highlight anything that's not right there, versus you having to click through your account or using the AWS console. So this is a really interesting just overview of like, that's why it matters to look at misconfigurations. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So let's look first at Dockerfile common misconfigurations. And I know this is not necessarily like you can use containers without using Kubernetes in one way or another, but ultimately that's where you want to get started looking at your misconfigurations, because like mentioned, anything that you have up in your container image that's not like it's supposed to be will dribble further down the line and will make your infrastructure and subsequent, like wherever you use those container images, less secure. So one of the things, like here's some like 5 common misconfigurations that are like really that are commonly done and that can easily be prevented. The first one is using deprecated fields. Fields in your Docker file are deprecated for a reason. Either they haven't been used like they are supposed to be used, and that's kind of a security issue, or for other reasons have been deprecated. So don't use deprecated fields. User is not specified. If you don't specify a user, the root user will be used for the container. So you want to make sure that you specify a user of how this container image is supposed to run. Then mounting host files, basically any operating system files into the container, giving the container access to host files. Unprotected secrets is very common. People use environment variables for their secrets and similar. Not really like managing them properly in a secure way. Generally it's anti-pattern to use environment variables. And then exposing the wrong port is another thing, or exposing ports and endpoints that shouldn't be. Next slide. So here's just a Docker file that I'm going to scan at the end of my part of the presentation and just show you how Trivy will detail the different misconfigurations within that Docker file. Next slide. So looking at YAML manifests and common misconfigurations there, one of them is using the default namespace. Ideally, you want to define a namespace in your Kubernetes manifest. Namespaces are there for a reason, because they allow you to have logical separation between your different workloads, your different running workloads, so they can't necessarily affect other workloads within other namespaces. Now, if you set the namespace upon installation, then maybe the next person will not use that same namespace or similar in an upgrade of the application, for example. Another thing is running with privileged containers, or not specifying resource requests that can result in in your infrastructure going funky. There are lots of different examples in that case. Also, if you define the image pull policy, like of your container image to always, it can happen that your the Kubernetes keeps pulling that container image for various reasons and is causing outages or your application to go down and similar. Then again, sharing host process and exposed public endpoints. There are actually a lot, like in the millions of endpoints, Kubernetes cluster endpoints exposed, because lots of times people are using local clusters and accidentally expose the endpoint of that cluster. Also, I think by default in AWS, if you spin up a container, the endpoint is public. Like you will still have to write permissions within AWS, but the endpoint itself is still public. So here's just from Target in 2018, they were running over 20,000 lines of configuration files. And if you think about that scale, if companies run so many configuration files, the likelihood of having misconfiguration is just a given. Next slide. I think now is the point when I'm actually going to share my screen. I'm going to show you how you can perform the scanning. So I hope you can see my terminal.
Yeah, we can see it.
My dog is taking apart my chair. That's the noise in the background. Apologies. So once you get started with Trivy, there are lots of different installation options. With the CLI, you will have all of the different scans that it can perform. So here are the different scans. In our case, we are going to focus on misconfiguration scans with Trivy config command. And here's just a list of other ways that you can use Trivy to scan other resources. So I'm here in the Trivy demo repository that I've set up. It's also, I can share right after I speak the demo link where you see lots of different examples of Trivy, including the misconfiguration scanning. Now within this repository, I have bad infrastructure directory. And within it, I have bad infrastructure related to Docker, Kubernetes, and then Terraform. And I can use Trivy config to go ahead and scan, for example, the Docker file that's in this directory, in the Docker directory. So Trivy config, and then it's going to spit out a list of misconfigurations within that Docker file. And that's a Docker file that you've seen earlier. So it starts with using the latest tag in the base image. That's one of the things that you will often learn first when you get started with containers, that you shouldn't use the latest tag for your images. Now, in total, Trivy did 22 tests on this Docker file, and of those, 5 were failures, and it's going to break it down by the severity of the failures. Now, what we can do is, in this case, the list of misconfigurations is fairly easy to navigate and to go over the misconfigurations one by one. But what happens if you have a huge YAML manifest, let's say, or a larger file, and you're bombarded with maybe 100 misconfigurations? What you can do instead, then in that case, is break down the different, or the severity, for example, of those misconfigurations. So we can specify severity and say high in this case. I don't think we had any critical ones. And then we just see the 3 high misconfigurations within that Docker file. And then you can break that down further with the different tags, just to make sure that you can filter the number of misconfigurations, and you can address them one by one. Next, we go ahead and we can scan also our Kubernetes manifest, and it's pretty much the same result. You will have a list, in this case, of different misconfigurations. If you perform vulnerability scans with Trivy, you will have a nice table, nice database. So this is basically the list of different misconfigurations in that Kubernetes manifest. Now, at this point, given how large this list is, it will probably rewrite it completely, this manifest, and then rescan it. Now, you can also, with Trivy, you could go ahead and use Trivy Kubernetes to scan your running workload. So you're running container images within your cluster. No, what I, however, do instead is I use the Trivy operator within my cluster. So I have here just a basic kind cluster, and within that kind cluster, I have the Trivy operator installed. And because it's a kind cluster, it keeps breaking. So let's just kick that pod. So I have here the Trivy operator installed within the Trivy system namespace, and the Trivy operator is just basically running within the cluster and looking out for any new resources that I have to scan. And then it performs on those new resources. For example, any new container image, it will perform vulnerability scans. If there are any new workloads, it will perform misconfiguration scans on those workloads. The thing is, if I have an application here, so for example, for my app namespace, I could go ahead and I could change the configurations right through the cluster, right? Which is not something that people should do to modify resources right directly in the cluster. No, if I change anything within the configurations to have more critical misconfigurations within those, then Trivy will pick those up in the next misconfiguration scan. And that's where you want to have static scanning, but also scanning of your running workloads. Yeah, that's it. That's what I want to share.
Anaïs, I think there's some questions.
Yeah.
One question from Jason, he says, in that list you had failures in the tests running. What does it mean for is that just like things that didn't pass?
So it's basically checking. So Trivy has a list of common misconfigurations, like from across the industry, basically best practices, also from the information that I given from the Aqua security research team. Basically, here is a list of misconfigurations that shouldn't happen within your Kubernetes manifest. And Trivy will basically look at your Kubernetes manifest and see, compare it with the database of common misconfigurations, and then perform checks. So if Trivy is performing 20 checks, then those are like the 20 common misconfigurations that could be present in that YAML manifest. But of those, if there are like 5 failures, then those are the actual misconfigurations. Like you have in that YAML manifest, there were 20 tests performed, but 5 of those failed. 5 of those are now the misconfigurations that you have present, versus the other 15 passed and are not part of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
We have another question. Does Trivy have a management console GUI in addition to the CLI?
So that's on our roadmap. For now, you can easily integrate, and I have some tutorials also on the Aqua open source YouTube channel on how you can set up Grafana and Prometheus with the Trivy operator, and then you have really fancy dashboards as well. So that's kind of your alternative to a GUI, and then you can also set up alerts as you would do for your observability stack and similarly. So you would
suddenly if you had like a 10x amount of misconfigurations, something bad's probably happening.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question. It says, will Trivy also find any misconfiguration that can lead to containers being able to access something it shouldn't? So sort of I guess this is in the realm of like privileged containers, but maybe around like namespaces and networking.
So generally, yes, if those are, well, generally, yes, but it's more like Trivy, it's more like the possibility of something happening bad, right? So versus Tracy, for example, will pick up any events in your cluster as they happen. So for example, if a container is actually trying to access something they probably shouldn't, that's when Tracy would notify you, versus Trivy is just more the possibility based on your configurations of something going wrong. So it really depends on what the process is. If Trivy will because the thing is, if you have a misconfiguration, it doesn't mean that it could either translate into several things going wrong of that container image, maybe doing lots of things, or like through the container image, maybe lots of things could be done wrong, but not one particular thing. So versus, so you can't really look at one specific event or one specific action of like versus the misconfiguration it might relate to, or a specific action exactly what might, yeah, like an action might relate to multiple misconfigurations.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. Another one, actually, I had this question myself.
Yeah.
When I was doing this, I tried running Trivy on GKE Autopilot, and they kind of locked down the control plane node. How does Trivy work for like managed Kubernetes providers such as Autopilot or EKS, where you don't have like direct access to the control plane node?
I haven't tried it yet on Autopilot. That's interesting. Like, you mean like in JKE, it's just gonna.
I think it works EKS because you have like a system masters role, but I believe when I tried running it on Autopilot, I think I probably need to define my service account as what permissions Trivy hits, and they may not always be available on like heavily locked down managed Kubernetes clusters.
That's the thing, because ultimately that's the thing, like you have to keep in mind, again, when you're choosing a security scanners need basically access to everything in your cluster. Like you can tell Trivy to just scan specific namespaces and then has only access to scan specific namespaces. That's something you could do upon installation. But ultimately, in terms of resources within that namespace, it will likely need access to everything. And that's why you want to be so careful when you're using a security scanner that's from outside the cluster or that's sending data somewhere else, because it ultimately, most of them have access to everything. So just iterating on that.
That's a good answer. Okay, I think that's kind of good questions. Let me share my screen.
Still need to press the other.
And I know we have let me resize mine. See how my terminal here we switch in between. So do you want to do like a last summary, Anaïs, for your slides?
A last summary.
I think this was it.
New security scanners. They are not as difficult as they seem to be. You will, through the scans, through misconfiguration scans, you can learn a lot about how Kubernetes actually works and why you would want to have certain configurations and setups and things like that. So use it as soon as possible. That's
okay, great. And then I think here we had like a segue into my slide, which is many misconfigurations around access control, which I can segue now. And so thanks, Anaïs. We'll be online to answer questions at the end as well. And so just to reiterate, the Red Hat State of Kubernetes security report from this year also said that most security incidents, 46%, were a result of misconfigurations, much more than vulnerabilities, which is sort of interesting. It's not 0 day that gets you, it's someone leaving, the front door open by accident. And one thing that we found at Teleport is, like, often when you start a vanilla cluster, maybe deploy microcreates or use one of the off-the-shelf Kubernetes distributions, it makes it very easy to get started. And by making it very easy to get started, there might be some some defaults which may not be great. And we recently made a video on securing a default Kubernetes cluster, 5 tips. You can scan both these QR codes to get the videos and also be in the show notes below. And I think this is sort of a segue into, is it a default or is it a misconfiguration? One classic example of this is when you have access to the control plane, you will often have access to the system masters role. And the system masters group. And the system masters group is sort of a super admin, which can do sort of everything in your cluster. And you will often need a role with this much permissions to run security scanning tools. And I think this is why it's important, to have an open source security scanner, because you do give it a lot of privileged access to your cluster. There's actually a great blog post from the Aqua team on don't use system masters. And this outlines some of the other options for using service accounts and sort of really limiting who has access to those roles. And in Teleport, we see 2 types. We see authorization, authentication, misconfigurations. Auth N is often getting access to the API, and Auth Z is what people can do with the API. And so most a common one you saw, I think, and he said there's like, I think 900,000, maybe 1 million Kubernetes APIs on the public internet. And some of these also allow, like anonymous auth, which is obviously not great to allow anonymous users to interact with your API. And then also just not securing it, you want to have like a firewall, you maybe want to limit the IP addresses, you may not want to put it on the public internet as an example. And then what do you do once people have access to the API is, following the principle of least privilege. And this is around creating service accounts and users, which they can only do a limited amount of action within the cluster themselves. For example, not using system masters. And then not auditing service accounts. Along with human users, you might have multiple other systems. It could be CI/CD, it could be other scripts. You might create long-lived service account tokens for them. And that has other problems, and I'll sort of dive into this. And then another example is container runtime security. I think Anaïs covered this, like running root containers. And lastly, like not keeping track of logs, knowing what people are doing within your cluster. And, for people who are sort of new to Kubernetes, there is a whole sea of different authentication methods that you can use, going from, tokens to authentication proxies to passwords. One of the best and most secure way is using certificate-based authentication, X509, but there are like a few caveats around using certificates for authentication. I would highly recommend, looking at our OpenID Connect and also service account tokens for short-lived tokens, and also tying it back to identity. And then you have to make sure, that everything is well maintained. So making sure you have user accounts and service accounts for people who have access in the cluster. So how do you run a tool like Trivy? I think we kind of already saw this demo for Anaïs. She downloaded Trivy. She already had the kube config. You run Trivy. This is a great way to get started. And within the Kubernetes flag, there's a few other options. So you can like pass in different kube configs, or you can pass in like the namespace to reduce the scan. But how do you get these kube configs? So depending upon your provider, once you have your Kubernetes installed, there's a range of tools that you use. So for if you're running something locally like Rancher or MicroK8s, they have tools to sort of export your kube config locally. If you're using a cloud hosted provider, you'll be quite familiar with commands such as the EKS Kubernetes export. And at least I know for the EKS one, this exports a certificate that's valid for 24 hours with whatever authentication process you have with AWS. But there are some problems with some kube configs. Kube configs can't be revoked that easily. So in the case of the 24-hour one from EKS, that kube config is pretty much valid for the 24 hours. You can't, I don't believe you can reduce the time. And you have to be careful that sometimes you can get a very broad range of permissions, which can lead to dangerous operations, depending if you're switching to multiple clusters. Last thing, I run a test all the time, so I run multiple clusters, like knowing what my current context is. Am I doing this in my staging cluster, my production cluster? And then lastly is knowing, who's interacting with the API. So this is where I'm going to introduce Teleport. Teleport is an identity native access for engineers and machines to get access to the kube config. So I'm going to sort of show you the experience of using Trivy with Teleport, and bring my terminal here. Let me make this a bit bigger. And this is sort of how I start my day. So I'm going to log into my Teleport cluster. And I have a couple of Kubernetes clusters. You can see I was trying with autopilot. And I need to log into my Kubernetes host. And so I can now get pods. I can, let's say, exec. I can just sort of go about my day, interacting with the Kubernetes API. And since I have the local kube config, I can now also run Trivy. And so I'm going to run the Kubernetes Also, you can use K8's report to run a summary on my micro K8's cluster that I have here. And it's just running. I believe this is this downloading the.
If you haven't used Trivy within like 6 hours, it will re-download the database. So every 6 hours, if you're not, you can also define a different time period, just mentioning it. Because especially for Trivy, for the Kate's command, what happens is like it's doing the secret scanning, which takes a lot of time. And I mean, among all the other scans, but you can also scan off it, like turn off like some of the secret scans, but just mentioning.
Okay, so then thank you, Anaïs. That was very helpful. You can see in my screen, I have like the vulnerabilities. You can see I have a few critical ones here on my ingress controller, my shell pod. And so now we can go similar. I believe is it all to get the more detailed response?
Yeah, I think so.
While that
So,
runs, I will show you. Teleport also comes with a web UI, and sort of under the hood, you can see that we have the activity. So all these Kubernetes requests here are the requests that Trivy is making on my behalf. So you can see it is looking for cluster role bindings. This one's looking at cluster roles. And so all of this activity is also audited along with the API. And another benefit of using Teleport is it also records like kubectl execs. So you can see this was the kubectl exec that I performed. And so as sort of engineers and developers, your day-to-day flow is very smooth. You can just sort of go about, just using a few different changes to how you're getting your kube configs. But from a security and also compliance perspective, it makes it very easy to see what's happening to your cluster. And then also having an audit log of all of the Kubernetes commands that you're running. And so you can see here, my micro K8's cluster has a lot of misconfigurations. And actually one of my favorite editions of Aqua, which I don't think Anaïs went to, is there's always a page that you can go to, and it gives you like a more detailed information to jump off and learn more about what's the impact of different vulnerabilities, which is I found super helpful. And so just to summarize, I don't think we saw me going through the GitHub authentication since I was already logged in, but all of my users are backed by GitHub SSO since I already authenticated for the day. I can do TSH status. You can see I have access for 8 hours for my certificate. And then you can also see I have the not great system masters group, but this is also something that can be customized on a per role basis through the teleport mapping. Roles are YAML files, but I'll show you the UI here. That there's options to add Kubernetes groups and Kubernetes users, and then also use labels for role-based access control. So yeah, demo using Trivy locally. I've done this. So just to summarize, Teleport consolidates the connectivity, the authentication, the authorization, and the audit. I think I showed all 4 of those. And then, so this was running it locally, which is great to get started. One thing that you might want to do between the operator and running locally is running something in, let's say, a CI/CD service such as GitHub Actions. And I think your option 1 is you create a service account, you export a long time to live service account, and then you upload them to GitHub Actions. And then the second option is we go to the same flow. You register your cluster in Teleport, you create a GitHub Action bound token, and then you use GitHub Actions. So for this flow, I've done the same thing, but instead of myself as the user accessing my Teleport cluster in my kubeconfig, I'm going to let GitHub Actions run and obtain the certificates for me using a new edition which launched last year called Machine ID. And what's kind of great about this edition is also completely secretless. Let's rerun this. I can run it live. And so I'm going to run this job here. And this job is going to just run the Trivy summary command, and it's going to fetch some binaries. We have our own GitHub action. Let's see how quick it's going to take. All right, maybe I'll show you a complete one. So if I come, oh, I think I'd have to let it run. So this is just configuring things. It's going to create a few different things. I'll show you the credentials afterwards. As this runs, I will come back and show you. So the old way, we talked about this, you do a kubectl create service account, GitHub actions, you create the service account and you export it. You have long-lived kubeconfigs, which are bad. It's also impossible to rotate X509 certificates within Kubernetes without a lot of breaking of other things. So really recommend using short-lived credentials. And then also there's not a huge amount of visibility into these credentials. If you're looking to use teleport machine ID, the process flows the same. You create a new token. You have a join method, which is GitHub. And so there's actually no token actually needed for this one. The token isn't a secret. We have a GitHub actions and it runs in CI/CD. So let's see where we are. Okay, so now we're running. I think we're running into the same thing. We're uploading our database here. But if I come up, let's see, you can see I have access to that shell demo that I showed you. And then the same as with all human actions, these actions are also recorded in Teleport itself. So you can see the bot GitHub actions have this request. So there's a full audit visibility into the user accessing it itself. Oh, and then we see it scanned. And the formatting is a bit weird, but it's the same results. I have a lot of critical issues that I should resolve in my Kubernetes cluster. And so there's some benefits around how it rotates it, how it retains the kubeconfigs. It's also secretless. There's no long-lived tokens that you have to worry about rotating. And if you run this on machines, it also supports our certificate authority rotation as well, makes that very smooth. So I think the third way, which Anaïs already covered, was the Trivy operator. This is a great way to install it and have a constant visibility into what's happening. And then last up, fixing the misconfigurations. I think I mentioned the report all. This is a great way to see links to the vulnerability database that links out to places. It's very helpful. I think actually someone asked this in the chat. Can you view the logs? I guess there's the -- output to sort of save the results to a file. And I think similar to many people who are like, let's say you have lots of tests that are failing, I think the best way to start is create like a baseline of how many security issues you have. I think I might check out the Prometheus dashboard, track them, and just make sure that you're hitting the key ones that are key to your business and try to resolve the most important ones that are relevant to you, but also keep track to make sure that you're not deviating more from the baseline. Oh, and then I have a bonus one. So I think prior to this webinar, Anaïs shared this tweet. What's her critical, what do people see as critical Anaïs misconfigurations and what should you avoid? And one thing that we see a lot is people exposing like dashboards. So it could be like the Kubernetes dashboard. It could be any internal dashboard that also inherits like a very privileged role within Kubernetes. Anaïs, do you have any other favorite ones that you saw from your tweet?
I mean, it's really just give your containers access to everything in your workload to make your life easy and expose endpoints so other people can manage your resources effectively, things like that. Yeah.
And so this is like a bonus one. So along with accessing the Kubernetes API, you can also use Teleport to access internal applications. And this means that you don't have to put these like applications on the internet. You can host them within Teleport, launch it, and it sort of run it as a sidecar to get access to these internal apps. So here's an example wiki. You see it's available like on the public there's a URL that's publicly available, but it's protected. You have to go through the authentication. So if you do have dashboards that you want to provide to a wider team, this is a very easy way to give them access without having to open up like an extra ingress gateway that you have to manage a firewall and limit. So I think next steps, I have a typo here. So these ones are the wrong way around. We have Trivy, aquasec/Trivy, and then gravitational/teleport. Are the two places that you can like download and try teleport. So this kind of brings us to the end of the webinar. I know we've been asking questions as we've gone. Let me see through the ones. So feel free to ask us questions and we'll kind of go through them now. I think Roy asked static password file or static password file. In the case of teleport machine ID, there's static, there's tokens, but the tokens aren't secrets. The way in which you create them, you limit which GitHub actions can join it. And it's another method for GitHub actions specifically. We also support CircleCI, GitLab, and an AWS IAM token join method. I think we had another question. How can we see the K8 scanning results? I think that's mainly through the CLI output, or you can save it to a file. Any other methods for the results?
So the K8 scanning from the cluster, it will produce CRDs, Kubernetes custom resource definitions, which are basically YAML reports. And then you could get the YAML reports out of the cluster as well as an alternative, or visualize them through Grafana and another tool. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like there's no more questions here. I'll give it a couple of minutes. I know there's always like a last minute question. So feel free to type them in. All right, well, if there's no more questions from anybody, feel free to reach out to both me and Anaïs. What's your best contact information, Anaïs, if people want to get in touch with you and ask more about Trivy?
Usually I say Twitter, but with Twitter being in Flex, you can always join the Aqua Security Slack. So if you look for slack.aquasec.com, that will lead you to our open source Slack. If you have any questions, we have the channels there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and the same for teleport. We have a community Slack. It's goteleport.com/Slack, and that'll take you to our Slack channel. Although you can also open probably GitHub issues if you have any issues, which actually helped me when I was preparing this webinar. So it's very helpful. So thank you everyone for joining today. Do you have any last closing thoughts or comments, Anaïs?
This was great. Yeah. It's great to see more people joining this webinar. Yeah.
Oh, and I have one last question around, does Teleport integrate with CircleCI? Yes, it does. And I think this actually just came out in 11.3. And so we're looking for people to try it out. I'm happy to give you a demo about that as well. Okay, great. All right, we're going to call it, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining today.